We ended the last lecture module talking about the 4 hypotheses that Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich introduce and discuss in the context of their paper. In this particular paper, they only offer up evidence in support of 2 of those hypotheses, though evidence can be found for the other hypotheses in different publications. We'll look at the data that supports hypothesis 1 and 2 as presented by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich in this paper. We'll start by looking at the example of TrueTemp, a thought experiment developed by Keith Lair as a counterexample to reliabilism. And we'll see that this data supports the first hypothesis, that intuitions vary from culture to culture. The second example we'll look at is the zebra discrimination case attributed to Dredsky. This data supports the hypothesis that intuitions vary from one socioeconomic class to another. Finally, we'll look at their data about a Gettier case. This data supports the hypothesis again that intuitions vary from one culture to the next. After we consider the data that they offer for hypothesis 1 and 2, we'll turn to the objections that they present in the context of their paper and the replies to those objections. We'll start by talking about the objection that their data invokes a sort of relativism. Then we'll look at the objection that suggests that their data doesn't undermine the central appeal to intuitions because these concepts and terms have many senses and hence can have different intuitions in different contexts. Then we'll look at the objection that the differences in intuitions are not philosophically significant. The objection that the intuitions are not driven by necessity in the way that philosophical intuitions are. The objection that the intuitions are not minimally reflective in the way that philosophical intuitions are. And the objection that intuitions are not sustained by community reflection in the way that philosophical intuitions are. Let's take a look at some of this data then. Now, in the paper that we're reading, the authors present a variety of evidence for hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. I'm only going to show you 3 of the many examples that they present. In addition to the data they present in this paper, in a paper Metaskepticism, Meditations on Ethno-Epistemology, they present some data showing the effects of philosophical education on intuitions. And that's hypothesis number 3. In the paper, The Instability of Philosophical Intuitions, Running Hot and Cold on TrueTemp, Stacy Swan, Joshua Alexander, and Jonathan Weinberger present evidence for hypothesis 4 with regard to the TrueTemp cases, that is, effects of order. So let's take a look at some of the evidence that's presented in this paper. Let's start with the thought experiment involving TrueTemp. The TrueTemp experiment was introduced by Keith Lair as a putative objection to reliabilism. The way the TrueTemp vignette works, an individual is hit on the head or drinks a potion or has an untoward side effect from an operation or so on. The result is that unbeknownst to them, they gain the ability to form very accurate beliefs about the ambient temperature in their surroundings. Since they don't know that they have this very reliable capacity, they form these beliefs in ways that don't seem to reflect anything that they believe about their abilities. Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich presented subjects from Western cultures and from East Asian cultures with vignettes describing the TrueTemp case and asked them to make intuitive categorization judgments to differentiate between really knowing or only believing. As the data reported here indicates, these subjects from Western cultures had a much higher rate relative to only believes of intuitions that the TrueTemp protagonist really knew. In contrast, the East Asian subjects tended to have a very low percentage of intuitions that the TrueTemp protagonist really knew as opposed to only believes. The data depicted here and in the paper is the relative percentages of individuals within each group who report really knows versus individuals within each group who report only believes. The second example that we want to look at is the example of the zebra case. The zebra case was first introduced by Fred Dresky as a version of the discrimination case. The idea with the zebra case is that someone takes their son or daughter to the zoo. They look around at all the zebras in the zebra cage and they judge them to be zebras. However, because of the distance, they couldn't discriminate between zebras and cleverly painted or disguised mules or horses or other animals. Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich presented vignettes with the zebra case to individuals identified as belonging to low socioeconomic groups versus individuals identified as belonging to high socioeconomic groups, where number of years in college was the discriminating criterion between low and high. High numbers of years in college were high socioeconomic individuals, and individuals who reported 0 to low numbers of years in college were low SES individuals. Again, when you compare the relative percentages of really knows to only believes across the two groups, you see a significant difference between the intuitions reported by the low socioeconomic group, which has a much higher ratio of really knows to only believes than the subjects in the high socioeconomic group. The final bit of data that I'll relay from the paper is a bit of data having to do with a standard Gettier type case. Again, they presented these cases to individuals from Western cultures and individuals from East Asian cultures. The cultural differences between the Western and the East Asian subjects led the East Asian subjects to have a much higher relative percentage of reported intuitions that the Gettier protagonist really knew, as opposed to the Gettier protagonist only believed, than the subjects from Western cultures. They suggest that the explanation for this difference has to do with the Western focus on causes that is contrasted with the East Asian deference to similarity between individual cases. This leads to quite divergent intuitions, they suppose, on these Gettier type cases. In sum, then, intuition-driven romanticism requires that intuitions prove relatively stable across cultures, across different socioeconomic groups, and in general, that they are relatively homogeneous, reflecting the relative uniformity of underlying conceptual competence across individuals. However, the vignettes that Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich employ seem to elicit highly variable intuitions. And in fact, I think it's significant, though they don't point this out, that there in fact is a fair amount of variation even within Western and Eastern cultures, within high and low socioeconomic groups. If the presuppositions of intuition-driven romanticism were in fact true, we would expect very little variation at all across all sorts of circumstances, and particularly within particular groups like Western cultures, East Asian cultures, high socioeconomic groups, low socioeconomic groups, and so on. In the next lecture module, we'll consider the objections that were raised to their paper and the responses that they made in defense of their paper.